Hello, health champions. Today we're going to answer the question of when does fat burning start during intermittent fasting? When do we really start burning belly fat and body fat during an intermittent fast? And if you look it up, you're going to get an answer something like after 6 to 12 hours. But we want to understand more about what's going on. So that makes some kind of sense because what they're thinking is that's when you're moving from a fed state to a fasted state. In the fed state, you're still processing through all the foods that you just ate, but when you're fasted, now you're kind of passed beyond that and living on things that your body has stored. And when we do a fasting blood test, then they recommend that you fast at least 12 hours so you can have worked through all of the previous meals and they're not going to affect what's on that blood test. We want to know the baseline levels of things like glucose, triglycerides, and insulin. But in terms of answering when fat burning starts, it's not quite that simple because in reality, your fat burning never stops. Your body always burns a mixture of fuel. But the question is, if you're interested in burning belly fat or body fat, then obviously you want to know at what point, under which circumstances and conditions, does the fat become the dominant fuel source. So fat is something we burn a lot of. We typically are going to rely on 50 to 95% of our energy supply from fat. And then someone's going to say, well, that's not me because I only eat 10% fat. I'm on a low-fat, high-carb diet. I only eat about 10%, so that 50 doesn't apply. And we're going to talk about why it still applies to you because carbs turn to fat, but not the other way around. And then someone says also about glucose, which typically you're going to burn 5 to 50%, and someone says, no, I eat a lot more than that. I eat 65% carbs, so I eat a lot higher. And again, you're not going to burn all of those 65 as carbohydrate. A lot of them are going to get turned into fat before you use them. And when it comes to protein, we are burning anywhere from 1 to 20% fat. And that could go up a little bit if you're doing some extreme, ridiculous diet like eating only rabbit, which is extremely lean, or if you're only eating like lean chicken breast, that could go up, but it would be a very unhealthy situation. So for most people eating some amount of carbohydrate or fat, then protein is probably going to be in that range. Now, normal blood glucose, what does that mean? How much glucose is actually floating around? Because that's the first thing we're going to use, okay? And 100 milligrams per deciliter is a normal amount. I like it to be a little lower, like 85, which I talk a lot about on my blood work course, but just to keep the math simple, we'll call it 100. And then most people have, the average size person will have about 5 liters of blood, which is 50 deciliters or about 1.5 gallons. So now we multiply the 100 milligrams times 50 deciliters and we end up with a number of 5 grams. That's 1 teaspoon of sugar. We're talking about eating hundreds of grams of fat or carbs, but at any one time, you have 5 grams floating around in your bloodstream. And if we're really, really strict about it, it's even less than that, because if this is a blood vessel and we have red blood cells floating around in here, and then the glucose is floating in between, now we had 5 grams total in the liquid portion, but about 40% of your blood is not liquid, it's cells, it's red blood cells, it's particles. So we have to subtract the 40% that is red blood cells, which means we end up with roughly 3 grams of sugar floating around at any given time in your bloodstream, and that's all there is. But keep in mind, this is a fasting level of glucose, and if we eat something, then that's going to go up. But how does the dynamic work there? So let's add some breakfast to this. And then we're going to add a low-fat, high-carb breakfast because that is what we're told to eat. The ADA, the AMA, the USDA, all those government agencies, all those medical associations, they tell us this is what we should eat because carbohydrates are the preferred fuel, that it's super important if we want energy to eat lots of carbohydrates. I'm going to talk about why that's a fallacy. So we have some skim milk, we have some cornflakes, we have some toast with jam, we have a glass of orange juice, and we have coffee, and we're very moderate. We just take 1 teaspoon of sugar in that coffee. So we add all this up and it's 101 grams of carbohydrate. So what happens now is that anything that we eat, so here is the digestive tract, and we just put 101 grams in about, let's say 15 minutes. We put 101 grams of carbohydrate into the bloodstream, and this is now going to be passing into the blood and eventually out of the blood. But what would happen if the body didn't have a really fast way of processing this? If this 101 grams went into the bloodstream before the body could do anything about it, if the body didn't have an efficient way of dealing with this, what would happen? And the answer is that we just increased the sugar, the blood sugar, 35-fold. So if the body didn't process and get rid of the sugar really fast, we would end up with a blood sugar of 3,400 milligrams per deciliter. And this, of course, is a hypothetical example because this is never going to happen. But we need to understand the magnitude of these things, that normally we have 3 grams and a typical breakfast would add 101 grams. So if the body didn't have a fast and efficient way, then this is what would happen. And that extreme level of blood sugar would be life-threatening. Pretty much anything over 600 is going to result in coma and death if it's allowed to go on for any length of time. So the body has a lot of safety mechanisms in place to deal with it, so make sure that it never gets to that point. One thing is to increase insulin and get the glucose into the cells. Another one is to use the glucose first, to make sure that whenever glucose is plentiful, that we use it first to keep it from building up. And we can also convert this glucose into fat. That'll get rid of some of it. And a very important mechanism is through the kidney. So whenever we have over 180 milligrams per deciliter, that's called the renal threshold. So anything below that, the kidney is going to reabsorb glucose because it's a precious resource, calories, energy, resources. The body is going to try to reabsorb them. But when it gets over 180, that's just way too high. And we're going to start spilling glucose into the urine as a safety mechanism. It's kind of like a pressure boiler or something. It has a safety valve so it doesn't explode. So when glucose is too high, then it starts spilling through the kidney. And now, with all of these safety measures, we make sure that that glucose never gets to those levels. But here's the interesting thing. So because of those safety mechanisms, because the body uses the glucose first and do all these different things to get rid of it, this is often misinterpreted as to mean that glucose is the preferred fuel. It's the most important fuel. No, it's the one we have to burn first whenever it's present. So let's think about it this way also. If you're standing in your kitchen and you're doing some dishes and you're kind of relaxing and then you look over and there's a fire, the toaster just caught fire and your cabinet's on fire, then are you going to stand there and continue washing dishes, or are you going to do something about the fire? So to think that glucose is the preferred fuel is the same as saying, I prefer to put out the fire before continuing with the dishes, all right? Whenever it's an emergency, that's what we deal with first. It does not mean that that's an ideal situation. Now, don't get me wrong. This does not mean that carbohydrates are evil. It does not mean that everyone in the world needs to eat 0 or extremely low carbohydrate. All it means is that there's something going on that the body has to respond to quickly, and most people eat too much carbohydrate. It does not mean everyone needs to be 0, but also it means most people should not be 50, 60, 70% of their calories from carbohydrate, because then over time you're going to break this intricate system. We're designed to deal with it to some degree short term, but not excess all the time. And when we're talking about processing and getting rid of this carbohydrate out of the bloodstream, where does it go? So there's a few different places. First of all, we can use it, which would mean about 50 calories per hour from carbohydrate, because we're always burning some fat as well. And if we eat 100 grams of carbohydrate, that's 400 calories, and we can use about 50 calories per hour. That means probably somewhere around 8 hours is the time it would take just to process through that meal. And we don't have that kind of time. So using it is available, but it's not going to be what happens to most of it. Then we can store it, and that's going to be a significant portion, but the storage is limited. So if we were absolutely starving, then we could store a lot of this as glycogen. But if we are on a frequent meal, high carbohydrate plan, then there's going to be very, very limited storage space, because our glycogen stores are typically going to be full. So the next step then, the next option is to turn it into fat and store it as fat, because that is basically unlimited. So now we take the carbohydrates, we turn it into fat, and then we can retrieve some of that. And this is why we will always burn more fat than we will carbohydrate typically, unless we just had a high carbohydrate only meal. So what about the other fuels? Well, it turns out fat is the preferred fuel. And there's many, many reasons for that. It burns very clean and steady. It provides a stable source of energy. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't create blood sugar swings or insulin spikes or any of that. And there is no conversion needed. Once we have the fat, that's how the body likes to store it. That's how the body likes to retrieve the energy from it. It is already fat. Okay? Glucose and protein can turn into fat. Fat does not turn into glucose or protein. It only happens one way, because that is how the body wants to store it. That is how the body wants to use it. And protein can become a fuel, but it's not supposed to. So when you eat protein, the purpose of that is to become tissue. You're supposed to build muscles and bone and skin and hair and things like that with it, building blocks, the body parts. And only when there is excess of protein do we turn it into energy. And so protein does not become a fuel for the most part unless we are just out of all the other kinds of fuels. So if you're on an extreme long-term starvation where people are close, when they're losing half of their body mass or more and they're close to death, then the body absolutely will start to use protein, but it's kind of like a last resort. And during fasting and starvation, your body will increase the amount of growth hormone, and growth hormone is muscle sparing, so that you preserve your muscles and you use up the fat first. Now let's look at some of this fat burning. So if we take a few different examples, and we're going to look at the fed state, which is where you have just eaten. We're going to look at the next stage when you processed through your previous meal and now you're starting to rely on glycogen. And then after the glycogen has kind of gone low and the body is starting to rely more on gluconeogenesis. So in the beginning, in the fed state, we're going to probably be using around 50 or a little bit more than 50% of energy from carbohydrates, and then roughly the same, but probably a little bit less of fat, assuming that this is some fast carbohydrates that need to get out quickly. And then what's going to happen, so here we have the fed state. We use some glucose, we turn some of the glucose into glycogen, and we turn some of the glucose into fat for later use. So that's the fed state. Now we're in the next state, and now we're going to be starting to use glycogen. So now the carbohydrate use gradually starts going down because there is less of it. We haven't eaten any recently. And as the carbohydrates go down, the body starts looking for another fuel source, and now fat consumption, fat burning increases. And as the glycogen goes down, we gradually start using more fat until the glycogen is kind of not necessarily out, but it's so low that the body is really starting to use more fat to look for that alternate fuel source. So now at this point, the fat calories, the fat burning is probably going to be more than the carbs. And again, this is not a line in the sand, but probably that might happen somewhere around 12 to 16 hours. So from that point on, then we increase the fat and we decrease the carbohydrates. So again, we don't know, depends on what you ate, depends on the metabolism, depends on how stubborn your body is, but probably somewhere around those lines. And now let's take the same scenario, but if we're on low carb. So now we would be at the same situation. We'd have a fed state, we'd have a glycogen and a gluconeogenesis. Because even if you're eating low carb, your body is still building up some glycogen, it's still relying some on carbohydrate. The only difference is that because you're consuming so few carbs, you're going to be at a much, much lower level to start with, and your fat burning is already going to be at a much higher level. Because remember, when you eat high carbs, a lot of those carbs turn into fat. When you eat high fat, none of those fats get turned into carbs. So when you eat low carb, high fat, those are pretty much the ratios that your body already burns. There's no conversion required. So then as you use up some glycogen, as you work through your last meal, there's going to be a very, very slight increase in fat burning, and there's going to be a very, very slight decrease in carbohydrate burning. Because again, you already had a lot of fat, you didn't have very many carbs, so it's not going to change much. And then we kind of continue out of more of a steady state after that. So on a low carb, high fat diet, then you're already burning fat. But I think here's the question that you really want to ask and get answered is, when does it switch from burning dietary fat to burning body fat? Because that's the whole point of this. We're trying to burn the body fat and the belly fat. And whenever you eat, then you're still providing calories and resources to the body. The beauty of the low carb, high fat diet is that you get more satisfied, you can eat fewer meals, and you don't get all these blood sugar swings and insulin spikes. So you get a much more stable energy supplies, and that reduces hunger over time. But you still have to burn through that last meal before the body has any reason to go after the body fat. And when might that happen? Well, depends on how often you eat, how big the meals are, but let's say you're eating twice a day, then maybe after 8 hours, maybe 6 to 8 hours, something like that. And now let's compare that with fasting. Like if we went more than 24 to 36 hours, then what does it look like? And it's not going to be all that different, but there's a few things that we want to understand. So first of all, there's no fed state, there's no glycogen state because you're not eating. So now you're in a steady state. So now your carbohydrates are going to be at a very low level, a steady state level, and the fat is also going to be at a very stable level. And if you've gone more than 24 to 36 hours and you're fat adapted, you're probably going to be using about 95% of your calories from fat and about 5% from carbohydrates. So again, we call that a steady state when there is no new food coming in and your body has gone long enough that it kind of established the baseline of where it wants to be. And it could take a little more than 24 to 36. It might be 3-4 days into it that you find that really steady state. But again, it's not very different from this. It's only going to be a few percent off from a low-carb diet. And now we're getting all the fat from the body because that last meal has been processed through long ago. And we're also getting all the glucose from the body. So the gluconeogenesis that we're talking about here at the end for the other categories, that's ongoing in long-term fasting or fasting over 24, 36 hours. And gluconeogenesis means that the body is making glucose from a non-glucose source. And there's basically two places to get that. That's from glycerol, glycerin. So when we're talking about fat, the way the body stores fat is as triglycerides. That means that there's 3 fatty acids connected to a glycerol backbone. And this glycerol backbone has 3 carbons that we can put 2 of those glycerols together and make a glucose. So that provides about 5% of the energy. So even if we're just eating pure body fat, you're burning pure body fat off the body, you're still relying on you're producing about 5% carbohydrate from that glycerol and the rest from fat. And the other source of glucose from a non-glucose source would be protein. But like we talked about, the body really doesn't want to break down protein because you need those muscles. Even if you've been starving or fasting for a while, you need those muscles to go out and find more food. So the body spares that by increasing the levels of growth hormone, of human growth hormone, so that, and they go up massively. They go up like 5, 6, 7, 800%, so that we make sure that we don't use that protein for fuel until it's an extreme emergency. When we're totally out of fat and carbohydrates, then the protein becomes the last resort. And what about belly fat? How do you burn belly fat as opposed to other body fat? Well, the answer is you can't, because the body makes no difference in the location as far as where you're burning it. However, there is some difference in terms of how we make body fat and where we put it. Because you've noticed some people have all their weight on their hips, some people have it all on the belly, some people have it a little bit all over. And that depends on hormones. And the hormones that tend to put on more belly fat is cortisol and insulin. So we can't do much about how we're taking it off. That's going to happen more uniformly. But if we can affect the factors, the hormones that put it on, then we can burn body fat from all over and we can put less belly fat on where it tends to accumulate. So the factors that matter is stress. Stress creates cortisol. Cortisol raises blood sugar. Blood sugar stimulates insulin. And therefore, stress is the factor that we want to reduce there. And then we also, of course, want to reduce insulin. So what's the big deal with insulin? Well, insulin is the hormone that helps move the glucose from the blood into the cell. Whatever we can't use in the moment gets either stored, which is limited, or converted to fat, which is unlimited. So already there, insulin is promoting fat storage. But it also directly promotes lipogenesis, meaning the formation of fat, primarily from glucose. And it directly prevents the breaking down, the burning of fat. So this is why when insulin is high chronically, when we're insulin resistant, then it takes a long, long time before the body starts burning fat. And rather than, if you're really insulin resistant, then the body is going to resist this curve going up. It's going to keep that fat in the stores, and it's rather going to tell you to go eat more food. And this is why on a high carb and an insulin resistance situation that it takes so much willpower, because we just can't get to that fat. The body is resisting burning that fat. But once we get fat adapted, the body is already burning fat, so it's much easier. Plus, with the low carb, we're not triggering the insulin so much. And as the insulin drops, we get more control of our appetite. And the most powerful way to reduce insulin is longer fasting, especially if we need to break a plateau. Like some of the people on low carb here, they might be burning fat, but their insulin is still kind of stubborn and they never get quite to where they want to be. And that's where a longer fast can be very powerful to break the plateau. And it is even much more powerful than keto, because when you're not putting any energy in, the body is really forced to start going after those fat stores. So when we ask this question, when does fat burning start with intermittent fasting? It's not a great question. We gotta ask some better questions. And one would be, when does most of the energy come from burning fat? And like we've talked about here, it depends on how much carbs you eat. If you eat tons of carb, it's going to take a while before the body switches to fat burning. If you're on a low carb diet, then your body is already burning more fat. So the simplest answer there is that it'll burn more fat when you eat less carbs. And that's the whole point of a low carb diet. But I think what people really want to understand and know is, when does the fat come from the body? When we're burning fat, we want it to come off the body. And then the answer is when we create a calorie deficit. And of course, that's going to depend on how well we can control hunger. Because if we're insulin resistant, we eat a bunch of starch, we're going to be hungry all the time. And when we cut back on the carbs, there's certain things that happen to create a calorie deficit, because we control hunger and appetite better. So the first thing is to stabilize blood glucose. And low carb, high fat will do that. We're not going to have these blood sugar roller coasters. And that's one of the most important things for stable energy, stable mood, stable appetite, is to stabilize blood glucose. And not only is insulin going to stabilize, it's also going to drop over time. Sometimes we have to do some longer fasting to break through plateaus with that insulin. And one more thing that's going to help is to eat real food. The more processed foods we eat, even if it's low carb, high fat, the more processed it is, the less nutrients, the more we're going to have a tendency to overeat. So you eat meat and non-starchy vegetables and leafy greens, and then you eat quality fats until you're full. And over time, that'll take care of the vast majority of this. And then you add a little bit longer fasting to that. And a lot of people are afraid of fasting. They've heard how important it is to eat, that you get your energy from food and so forth. But realize your body has ways to dealing with this. And it is actually a really good idea to go without food sometimes for a while. And it is actually a whole lot easier than most people think. And one thing you have to realize is that hunger is a habit. You're probably not going to get as hungry as you think, but even so, it's just hunger. It's just a habit. You're going to get hungry around the times that you've trained your body to eat. And it will remind you with hunger and say, hey, it's breakfast time. Hey, it's lunchtime. Hey, it's dinner time. But if you ignore it, it will go away really quickly. And the keys to doing it even more successfully is to make sure that you get plenty of fluids and to understand that fluids and electrolytes go together. So if you're losing electrolytes and you're drinking tons of fluids, you might just wash out even more electrolytes because electrolytes bind the fluids. So you have to take them together. And once people go from fasting without to fasting with electrolytes, many report a dramatic difference in how easy it is. And if you want to try some electrolytes for fasting, I created a product just for that. It's called Ulite, and I did it because I couldn't find anything out there that was safe, that didn't have sugar or artificial sweetener or artificial colors or things like that. So that's number one, is that it's safe. But I also wanted a little bit more than what was out there on any other product. So this is basically a 4-in-1 product where you're getting the electrolytes in a balanced ratio. You get trace minerals, and you also get a couple of things for tissue healing and metabolic and blood sugar support. So you could go to uvexia.com, or you can just click the link below. And it's made so that you could take a little bit for ongoing supplementation, or you can just do a little bit more intense during a fast. And if you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.